We're really delighted tonight to be able to partner with Kyiv to LA for hosting tonight's guest. Asha Bubiyemsky has been, contacting me for a while with some really wonderful artists, and we're finally able to host one, Mykola Ridnyi. I've got to get it right. I took practice with your last name too. And I think you'll find these works really quite moving and quite profound. We'll be able to talk with Mykola after the show as well. But in introduction, let me first introduce Asha Bubiyemsky, who runs Kyiv to LA. Talk about that. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for coming, and also thank you, Adam, for co-hosting and working on this. It's been really great to move the whole series around. So for those of you who are familiar, Kyiv to LA is a program that I started 2 years ago after the full-scale invasion, and it's focused on bringing Ukrainian artists to LA so that they can experience a residency and also have a public program. And I'm really excited. Mykola and I had connected about 2 years ago. We've done some programming online, and it's great because Mykola's now been in LA for almost 2 months. He's then going to go to New York and do a screening at Eflux Screening Room as well, so you can tell your friends in New York about it. And so the initiative is really focused on bringing people together in a more intimate setting, hence the pierogies outside, which I encourage you to have some after the screening. And Mykola is also, most importantly, these are artists working in film in addition to other mediums. So Mykola is an artist, a filmmaker, and curator. He currently lives and works in Berlin, where he holds a guest professorship in the lens-based class at the Berlin University of the Arts, UDK. Ridnyi works across media ranging from installations, collective actions in public spaces, site-specific installations, photography, and short films. His work has been shown internationally, and it's really exciting because this is the first time he's showing his work in LA. And I'm so happy to be working with Adam on this. Thank you for this. And I'm going to hand it over. We will be showing 5 works tonight. And Mykola will be able to tell you a little bit more about it. One of the works, probably we should have a trigger warning. It includes some images that might be disturbing. I don't think it is, but just in case. So I'm going to hand it over to Mykola, and he can talk a little bit more about the selection we have tonight.
Thank you, Asha and Adam, for the introduction. Thank you for coming. Happy to see you. I would not say there are disturbing images in the films. I'm actually thinking a lot how not to reproduce violence on the screen while we talk about violence in films. I just say a little bit about the selection, what you're going to see. It's 5 short films made during the last 12 years. So the oldest work is from 2012. Most of films related to my hometown in Ukraine, which is Kharkiv. I lived there most of my life before I moved to Kyiv and later to Berlin. So the city itself, like its spaces, but also people who live there, people who run important culture initiatives and activities in the city, and whose life being interrupted by a Russian war against Ukraine are important matters of these films. But the last film which you will see is kind of different. It's more a performative experiment, which I did already in Berlin. And it's much more speaks about Ukrainian history and how it was interconnected with a global history, and particularly history of culture and arts. But at the same time, when you speak about history today, it inevitably connects us with a contemporary moment. So I wish you a good screening. I believe I cannot say I wish you a nice screening, because the films are about quite hard topics and aspects of reality. Yeah, but I wish you a good screening, and I hope we will have a moment to discuss the films, and you can ask the questions afterwards. Thank you.
I think that last work is a really nice culmination of all the works that we saw tonight, because we also were watching works over the course of the past decade, and I think this last work really tied everything together nicely. So I'm actually do you want to open up the conversation?
Yeah, I'll start with one, because I want to bring back a statement you made in your introduction, which was the idea of trying to make films about violence without violence in them. And of course, you've made a series of works here, and the last one is one, I think, where you achieved that, but obviously there are differing examples in your earlier films of either doing that or not doing that. I mean, obviously, in No Regrets, there's, it's a portrait of people dealing with violence by doing violence to themselves. And there was an earlier time in Los Angeles, I remember, for example, Ron Athey is the one who I most remember, but a variety of people who were dealing with AIDS and the lack of attention to AIDS through self-piercing and performance rituals. But I think the place of finding, trying to deal with pain, a larger societal pain, and the only way that one could find something that could remotely match it, of the violence of society at that time, was to do something that was extreme and painful to oneself. So there's a couple of different thoughts there, but I'd like to see if your view of No Regrets parallels my response to it, or what you felt, and if that was something that perhaps led to your search for a way to discuss violence without violence in your filmmaking, or what led you to your pursuit of making media pursuing that?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, the No Regrets is a very particular work because I filmed what you see in the video in 2011 in one of the Kharkiv's nightclubs. And then a few years I didn't really know what to do with the material, so I came back to it only in 2016 and finally edited. And in 2016 the war already started in Ukraine, so you know that the large scale or full invasion is of 2022, but a smaller, let's call it smaller war is ongoing from 2014. Maybe I just finally came to the point why it makes sense to show it and edit it that way, because what we see is it's of course violent, but to me it's not a real violence, but a repetition of violence. It's exercises in violence, if you like, and exercises to try your own body and its limits. And this is the interesting thing, because that people in the video, they had the choice to do that or not to do. There is actually a moment, so you see a group of people who are trained to do that performance, and then there is a moment where they invite people from the audience, from the crowd, to try that for the first time in their life, and those whom you see, they agreed because their own will. And that is entirely different situation compared to the violence of war, where people basically don't have a choice. They just stuck in a certain situation, being like hit by rockets, being shot. But also there are other people who volunteered, also many young people volunteered to be in Ukrainian army to defend Ukraine. But then in the end you don't really know where you will appear to be, because army and war, it's a different type of reality than the civic life.
If I might just follow up briefly on that, since I think we'll talk more about the war, of course. But in 2011, what was the social situation or the socioeconomic situation that was leading to these performances?
I would say the suspension performance has a long history, and it is exist in the Western countries since much earlier. So I would not compare it with a social situation, maybe only in the sense of a certain escapism, the desire to run away from the reality and dissolve yourself in the pain. Which is of course not imaginable today, when the reality completely changed. Sorry, just a little addition. And that of course it provokes to think about the role of pain in these different realities, because somehow the disaster and the extreme pain during the war becomes a new normality when you experience that, when you see that in the case of other people again and again.
So I'm really glad you brought this up, because when I think about pain and trauma, there's this, so the narrative of pain and trauma, right, is something that you can pass down through storytelling, right? So there's the memory of it, even if you physically don't feel it or have the memory of it yourself in your own body. And then there's the trauma that is physically inherited. And this is something that now people understand, that you can be born with a kind of physical trauma. And what's interesting about these films is, when I watch them, is a lot of them have to do with the narrative of self in relationship to their environment, whether it's being in a cellar and this kind of preservation of fruits and vegetables, an escapism of a place where the grandfather could go and drink moonshine, but then also that connection of that form of escapism that was happening in a cellar, or if, let's say, a necessary element that was also tied to a specific moment. And so I'm actually really curious about how your practice, we've shown works over actually more than a decade that have to do with narratives, and how people also not only inherit those narratives, but how they also decide to embody them, and how they decide to engage with them. That a lot of your stories too are often playing with this idea of not, let's say, documentary. How would you say that that's really shifted? Because you first made this work, this particular work, No Regrets, in 2011, but then you revisited it in 2016, which is after 2014, which for those of you who are maybe not familiar with Ukrainian history is sort of the moment where you had the Orange Revolution. There's these sort of punctuations of Ukrainian in our generation of moments in Ukrainian history where there's this external force that then solidifies. I am so sorry, I'm like definitely on a tangent. Okay, my question is, how has your, not just practice been changed by these moments, but how has your way of composing narrative changed in relationship to these historical moments that have punctuated your own life in relationship to all the events that have been taking place?
Well, there is many things to say in response to your question. The thing is that when you analyze the film like No, 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 for example, which is made in 2017, you basically will see that many things which are heroes of the film are saying is like dystopian or nightmare visions or previsions of the situation, which basically after a few years became true. It just became a reality. So the guy who did the computer game about Kharkiv, it's basically how Kharkiv looks now, a few years after he did it. Also important to mention that you've seen these films not in a chronological order, but in a specific order which I composed to like link them in between. So The District, the film about my neighborhood where I was growing up, is actually one of the latest films I did alongside with The Battle over Mazepa. Through it's very different films, but anyway, well, lots of things changed, but maybe one which is very important is that I'm not living in Ukraine anymore. And I cannot make films and other works in the same way how I was producing them before. So, for example, the interesting thing about The District, that this is the film which was made on the distance. I was already in Berlin when this film was made. So I visited the city, the Kharkiv, in the beginning of full-scale invasion. So I got just some sketch footage on my phone, and only later come with an idea what it should be. But I was need to offer a little crew in Ukraine to film it from the distance. And then maybe the distance is an important concept here, because The Battle over Mazepa is also very distant work, but it brings sort of Ukrainian reality, Ukrainian context and history into international one, and depicts their reaction and interaction with international context.
Since you mentioned The District as well, and one thing I find in common with that and Father's Story is sort of the idea of abandonment. Both of them are places that were basically abandoned. And I'm curious about if that's something you perhaps are sensitive to because you have left Kharkiv. So one could interpret it as a way of your abandoning that place. I'm sure is a possible read of that, but I wonder if that's an additional sensitivity for you in those films, or perhaps a source of your interest in those?
Hard to say, but I think I was always interested in abandoned places. There is also another film which was not shown in the frame of this selection. It was a film about anarchist squad in Kharkiv, which is also was abandoned place, which start to have a new functions, new energy, and new life. Speaking of a cellar, fathers and grandfathers and mothers cellar, initially the idea behind this work was to document the space tied to the past. So I was thinking about cellars as the space which is like a relict of Soviet Union and Cold War, But you know, the sad irony is that it became very actual place to hide from the new war, and even some this food stocks could be used again. And unfortunately, this is actually what happened. So after almost 10 years after it was filmed, so basically my parents used to hide in that cellar from Russian attacks.
In the district, you play with memories, perhaps both past and present and potentially future memories, with these kinds of symbols and erasure, right? So in the district, you're going through different areas and you're picturing it as it is fairly contemporary, but then you blur out certain areas. You blur out areas of potentially where there might be dead bodies, you blur out areas that may have been destroyed, but then you're also blurring out areas of things that once were. And the one that I really liked was when you were talking about the beer bottle that fell out of your friend's backpack, and the hops essentially become these kinds of blood splatters. And it made me think how this is a kind of continuing streak throughout your works in which the one kind of memory, the one visual emblem becomes something else potentially. And in a strange sense, I actually feel like the battle over Mazeppa plays with that, but perhaps maybe a little bit on a larger geopolitical narrative in which people are arguing over the intricacies of what that symbol might actually mean and who it's for or who it was made by. And so I would love for you to talk about the works that we saw tonight are really varied visually, how you are presenting them, the kinds of visual images that you're presenting that are family images presented on top like a collage. The Battle of Mazeppa is quite theatrical and playful and also very comedic, whereas other pieces, you're very much in the environment itself. And I was actually hoping you could talk a little bit about how you're playing with these narratives and memory and also distancing yourself from portraying violence through these different means.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in such situations when the war interrupts peaceful life, you find yourself in a very delusional mode. Like you cannot understand especially your first reaction. You cannot understand where is a reality and where is a dream or fiction. You know, because just the reality around you was entirely different one day ago or a few hours ago. So the expression that many Ukrainians, but not only, I think also people in other countries, people here as well, were not expecting that the war in such scale will really happen. And when it happened, it was need some time to proceed what is going on. So then you become like trapped in a double delusional situation. So you are not sure, is this what is going on around you is real or unreal, or was those situations from the past almost never exist because everything so rapidly changed. This is why, like, when I visited the district where I was growing up in spring of 2022, it was a very strange feeling. Like, it was hard to associate myself with actual place where I was growing up, because it looks like it's not possible to live there anymore. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, is there a path? Do you play then with, in other works, notion of surreality, of obviously, if things can't be real, there's another mode of expression for potential exploration. Well, that one brief question first, and then I have another. But since your work comes through more documentary modes, I would say, rather than exploring possibilities of surrealism or alternate realism.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the films or video works I did, I'm not calling them documentaries, but they are definitely documentary based. But it's also the question of it's related to the question of medium, maybe, because what is documentary today? What is the reality today? Where it exists? Because I believe it exists not only on the street level, but it also exists in the social networks. It exists in a variety of video blogs and even fiction films. And why? Because all of these registers of the reality influence each other. So you cannot say anymore what's influence what way more. Reality influence what we see on the screen or see on the phone, or the opposite way. We know also that social networks are influence the way how we talk, how we think. They predict certain actions. And that was, I hope it worked well, but that was one of the ideas I wanted to put particularly in the No, No, No.
Before going back to No, 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 let's, I was curious, since you're wearing a Mazeppa shirt as well, but why Mazeppa? Like, how common is knowledge and importance of Mazeppa in Ukrainian education today? Was it something that you knew could be a touchstone for all viewers, or is the partial obscurity of it something that you served your purposes as well? And then how did you even come to think of doing this sort of poetry slam performance iteration of it?
Yeah, Mazeppa is a large topic, but I hope you already got quite a lot of information about historical context from the video itself. But why it is important, I think, because it's such a very contrast figure who is a national hero in Ukraine today, and from the perspective of Ukrainian historiography, and iconic anti-hero or villain from the Russian perspective. And that perspective didn't really change since the Poltava battle, so centuries ago, and since he was damned by a Russian Orthodox Church. And actually on the church level, that wasn't changed until today. But then I just start to research what kind of traces Mazeppa left in the international culture, because from the real person and real political figure, he became almost a meme, if you like, or at least the culture figure after and thanks to Lord Byron, who wrote this also in a way surreal, in a way delusional poem dedicated to Mazeppa. And after him, on the basis of his poem, there was a variety of theatrical plays in Europe. Then somehow Mazeppa as a culture figure traveled even to the United States, and the story completely lost its roots, because there was a radio shows in the US called Mazeppa, and still there is even a few small towns in the US, both in the US and Canada, called Mazeppa because of him, or maybe because of that radio show. I'm not so quite sure about it. But coming back to the aspect why Mazeppa and rap battle, like why this opposition and hip hop, I think partly the rappers, the performers themselves answered that question, because that was like a first association to them when we start to discuss the idea of the performance. Because Pushkin, the famous Russian poet, wrote his poem as an answer to Byron, but it was an answer made as an opposition. So it even starts with a reference to Byron, but then he tells completely different story, which pretty much remind me a rap battle, or it could be actually something else. Could be political debates, for example.
Yeah, I actually, as somebody who has knowledge of Ukrainian history from my family, but who's grown up in North America, I actually saw the whole Battle of Mazeppa play out in a way that really captures in my mind how Western, and whether it's North American or European media, will argue about a subject without actually having anybody from that place talk about the subject matter. And that's what I also find so entertaining about this rap battle, because this actually feels like it's this embodiment of how you have this whole political, news cycle happening where you have people that are on opposing sides talking about it without actually having anybody from within that subject to talking about it, and then you invite all these other speakers to interpret it. And so I remember when I first actually met Korda in person, we had done online screenings together. We actually met in a bar in Berlin, and he was telling me about this work, and I'm going, oh my God, this is amazing. This sounds mind-blowingly incredible, because it actually, in my opinion, highlights the absurdity of how you will have all these scholars and all these professionals in the field debating something, in the end that no one who's actually intimately connected to that place will be involved in this, whether it's the battle or the letters or the story or the narrative. And so there's this theatricality to it that I think really perfectly embodies how, at least from my viewpoint, how we watch these news cycles are always taking place, and also how the narrative is written. That's ultimately what it comes down to, is there's this romanticism or, the villain that gets played in this. And the thing that I found what was really interesting is how you didn't just show the finished product, which was the performance, the rap battle itself, but how you interviewed and how you decided to actually precede the rap battle with the conversations and the thoughts of these different individuals that are coming from very different places to talk about their viewpoints. And so it almost felt like this inverted way of approaching any kind of narrative that I thought was really beautiful, that was also unusual for me to experience. And so I'm curious, when you decided to come up, the idea that you were like, let's make this into a rap battle is kind of mind-blowing to me, but I'm curious how you actually settled on not only the rap battle itself, but how and when you also decided to engage with the people, because narrative is a big element of your work. Talking with people is a big element of your work. That we've seen that in all of your works. But when you have such a performative gesture that isn't perhaps the first person, how and when you decided to bring in the conversations with the actual performers. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, so I think one of the first ideas was actually to invite Ukrainian rappers and to stage the whole thing in Ukrainian language. But then I started to think, the genre of spoken words or rap performance, it's very fast, if you would watch it, you will not get the whole sense, the whole feeling just from the translation and the subtitles. It would be really hard to read. But this is like a technical aspect, why in the end it's people from different countries, different gender and different race. But conceptual aspect of that is actually because Mazeppa is not just a Ukrainian thing, not just Ukrainian figure, but someone who became a symbol in the international culture, circulated in that culture for more than a century, a few centuries basically, and then slightly like to the middle of the 20th century was dissolved and erased. So no one knows who is that today. So that also related to the idea to bring this phenomenon back to the international culture through the different reactions and responses, because as you said, and this is how it is, the lyrics performed by the rappers, it's their lyrics, it's their take, after, of course, discussions which we had.
So they basically wrote their scripts based on elements of the text that you also worked out with them?
So these two texts by Byron and Pushkin, especially Pushkin's text is quite a long poem. It's almost like 100 pages, I think, and like they're both complicated texts. They're depicting the life of the hero in different periods, like young and elderly man, from different sides. So you can really get lost in those two texts. So for that reason, I decided to work with the colleague. So it was a collaboration with Susanna Stratling. She's a professor in Free University in Berlin, and basically she's dealing with comparative analysis of literature in her work. So together with her, we built a structure, the structure of the 6 rounds, which you see in the film. And then the structure with different thematic lines and directions was proposed to the performance as a proposal. Some parts were actually too complicated for them, or so like they also played our own role in choosing what they like to deal with. So yeah, in the beginning it was a workshop we ran with Susanna together with them, and after that, they had the time to think about it, to discuss it in the group also, and come with their own reflections and lyrics.
And then, were there any concerns that said it was commissioned by Pushkin House? So I wonder if Pushkin House had a bias or how they supported it.
That's an interesting question. So this.
Provide some context. Pushkin House also where it's based.
Yeah. So this work was commissioned by 2 institutions in England. One is Pushkin House in London and John Hansard Gallery at the University of Southampton. And speaking of Pushkin House, so this is the institution formed by Russian Jewish migrants after Second World War, and for a long time it was exist with the support of British government, like to oppose Soviet Union. Today it's like Russian opposition background institution in London dealing with international projects and exhibitions. But of course, this was kind of provocative to do it with Pushkin House. First of all, because they have this name of the writer and poet who is not really my hero. So to me, that was a gesture of institutional critique to speak about actually Russian imperialistic legacies of Pushkin heritage. But yeah, it was quite supported from their side, because like they, as a Russian, the institution with a Russian background appeared in a strange situation in London, like being disagree with the regime in Moscow, but at the same time trying to find a way how to talk about it.
One more about No, 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 and then we'll see if there's any questions in the audience. But I want to see how you found the people who were in No, 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 and what were their characteristics that intrigued you to include them in the film?
Yeah, it's maybe related to methodology, how I worked with the camera, and how it changed through years. Because I think 10 or 15 years ago, I was always working with the camera, so camera was almost like a continuation of my hand. And just filming different situations in the city, at the parties, like everywhere. So a lot of material which was included in No, No, No was filmed that way, like a video diary, which you just film, then you put it on a table, and then after some years, you come with the idea how to edit that. So people whom you see in the film, it's basically just people from the culture community around, whom I met in that years, and whose activities, whose life and stories I found interesting. And maybe it's also, I hope you're all curious what actually happened with them after the film, because the film was made after the full-scale invasion. So none of these people live in Kharkiv anymore, but they're luckily safe and settled down in different countries like Poland, Germany, and one person lives in a very western part of Ukraine.
Some of them are also in the army too. Some of the people that you filmed are also in the army. I mean, it's vast. They're spread out.
No, but they are not. None of them is in the army.
Not in No Regrets.
No. This is with No Regrets. It's unclear what happened to them. Actually, in the case of that film, the connection with the performers was lost through years, very unfortunately.
And so I want to see at this time if there's any questions from any of you. Here, I'll start with Irina.
Yeah, I'm sorry I got here late, so you may have talked about this in the introduction, but I'm actually curious a little bit about your biographical information. So you were in Kharkiv, your parents stayed. Did you leave before the full-scale invasion? And then, because you said then you went back to visit, and the going down into the cellar, that one was just on a visit. And then I'm just curious where you did your filmmaking before you were in Berlin, and how long have you been in Berlin? I'm just curious to contextualize your shifts of style as you were moving.
Yeah, I lived in Kharkiv biggest part of my life. So I left to Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine, in 2017. So the time when the film No, No, No was made, actually. Yeah, and when the full-scale invasion started, I was in Kyiv. So I was in Ukraine first half a year of the full-scale invasion, which means that I was moving all the time for security reasons. So I left Kyiv immediately to the western part, and then, you know, the military situation was changing rapidly during that year. And the territories around Kharkiv region was released by Ukrainian army. So I visited the city around that time and had the first footage from Saltivka district. Yeah, but my parents are unfortunately still in the city, so they did different tries to go out. They lived on the west of Ukraine, but you know, for older generation of people, it's kind of more hard, complicated to immigrate without knowledge of other language, but also with close ties to their land, to their house, and stuff like that. But yeah, we're constantly in touch, and they are in a relatively safe situation. But that's, of course, there is no guarantees about the future.
You spoke in the district about the moment where you started calling yourself Mykola, and I'm assuming that was a moment of kind of political decision at a certain age, perhaps with your other school children. Can you talk a little about that moment, and was it before the 2014 invasion? And then one small question about one of the films, the young woman who talks about being beaten up, and she reenacts some of what she's doing. I was a little lost there because she talks about the right, and I wasn't sure who the right would have been in that context, because I kind of lost what year it was, and so I was just curious about that.
Okay, so it's important to understand about Ukrainian context the language situation. So basically most of people in Ukraine speak or at least understand two languages, which is Ukrainian and Russian. So it depends on the family. And my first language and the language of my parents was Russian. So I learned Ukrainian in a school, but yeah, and I think since school time I start to use both of them. And as it's shortly described in the film, so the Russian version of my name was associated with, it's basically coming from Orthodox religion. So Nikolai is one of the saints, which I, from a youth period of my life, didn't want to be associated with. So in this sense, Mykola is more neutral and like free of interpretations. I think this is why I decided to call myself in this way.
On the other half of that, which was the woman who reenacts her being beaten, and she refers to the right.
Yeah.
So where does that political spectrum sit for her?
Yeah, so she's not a woman, first of all, but agender. And this person, we met at the anarchist squad, which I mentioned in Kharkiv. And you know, Ukraine is not exception from other countries where you have left-wing subcultures and right-wing subcultures. Both are present, and basically their story depicting the situation of this confrontation happening. Even I would not call it maybe confrontation today. We have a confrontation which is the war with Russia. But there are conflicts and discussions in the Ukrainian society because if you look at the Ukrainian army and different people who serving there, they all have a very different backgrounds, and there could be like people with some Antifa background and with some radical right-wing background. There is even a community of LGBT plus people who joined the army as well. It's called Unicorn Unit. So yeah, and obviously different people have a discussion because they have a very different visions of the future of the country and coexistence. But today, as there is the war, it's not the number one discussion, of course. The number one discussion is how to survive and how to beat the enemy, because that's the main danger at the moment.
Additional questions?
I have a question about your concern that you articulated at the beginning about depicting violence. We live in a world in which there's the real war, but I think the more important war is on social media. Who gets to show more brutality? I mean, that's the reality, unfortunately. And in a US media landscape in which many legacy media will not show certain types of stories, my question for you is, how do you think, as a filmmaker who deals with, at least in some of your films, with political issues, how do you navigate that space? Because most people in this country, their understanding of Ukraine comes from TikTok, right? How do you create a third space, which is not, I used to work for international organizations, so we would create documentaries on war crimes. There, the goal is very clear, document for the International War Crimes Tribunal. But how has your work been influence, recognizing that billions of people in this world are desensitized on an hourly basis?
Well, actually, the selection of found footage in the film No, No, No is taken from social networks. But that is a very particular type of footage because you never see the war like next to you, close to you. But all of that videos are about the distance. And I think the distance is a more important word here when we speak about social networks, because that's create the distance to reality. So it's like the war in Ukraine is present, but it's somewhere else. It also creates this safe, the screen of the phone creates this safety. And even there is such problematic thing that people actually enjoy watching violent news because it's intriguing, it's keeping tension, it's like a suspense movie in a certain way. So for this reason, all of these videos in No, 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 you never see the brutality of war, but it's somewhere else. It's behind the trees, behind the houses, or behind the horizon. Yeah, so that's quite a big problem. So how to speak about the war and violence, how to show it, but in order not to kill the empathy and compassion among people. And in this sense, I think, I hope artists and filmmakers can do, can provide a certain alternative to the way how many journalists and news agencies are working today.
Any other questions from any of you? Here you are.
Yeah, I really like your film, and then particularly the first 4. Now, I was wondering, when you went back in 2022, you said it was kind of vacant. And I think you had just answered a lot of the questions that I was going to ask. But if you were to continue and do a 5th one on the community that you were brought up in, what would you have shown? What would be relevant there as a apartment, as a community? I mean, it went through 10 years of evolution. I can see that. But then, what would be there today?
As I'm not living in Ukraine anymore, there are also some ethical aspects in this question. So I don't feel like it would be correct from my side to do the work about people who are staying and living in Ukraine right now, because I'm not there. But at the same time, another, like a big change which happened, that now you have a large Ukrainian communities in different countries, so migrant communities. And particularly in Berlin, whereas this community is huge. And also, speaking of people who've been related to art and culture, it's really big. So answering your question, and when I'm thinking about some future collaborations and direction of the work, I'm actually thinking about experience of migration and what people feel, how it changed people, influenced them in this regard.
Asha, do you have one last thing to ask, Mykola? Otherwise,
Maybe something about rap, hip hop.
Here you are.
Oh, and I was just going to ask about, what is the deal with the rap in Ukraine? And there was the Russian soldier who had the whole performance that you'd gotten the documentation of, either social media or actually. And then, being involved with all the performers who do it, knowing the dynamics of it also. What's the presence? What's your relationship? Just curious.
Yeah, that
what,
was
what
actually.
did you want to say? What did you want to say?
That was actually a Ukrainian soldier. So he was just rapping in Russian language because, I know it's a bit complicated to understand, but as I said, like, people use both of languages. Now, when the war is at such enormous scale, of course, more and more people switch to Ukrainian as a political choice. But still, there are cases like in Ukrainian army, also some people speak Russian. As I remember it, I would say that as a music scene, it was more active and interesting, actually, in 1990s, the end of 90s. And particularly Kharkiv was important because it was one of the centers of the young rap scene, but as I say that in the film The District, I was not a part of that at that time. So I was in more like rock and punk subcultures. But now all of this also mixed, there is it's not, rappers and metalheads are not enemies anymore. So all of these subcultures mixed all over. You can see different bands mixing styles at the same gigs and festivals.
Do you have any last thought?
No.
Okay. All right, well, this has been a really wonderful conversation. We'll continue in the lobby for anybody who has further questions. But I really wanted to thank Kyiv TLA, Asha Bugodansky, and Mykola Ridnyi, and want to thank you all for coming tonight. And I understand that there's more pierogi in the lobby as well to have drinks. There's always an unending supply. Thank you very much all for coming, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.